Most students of the Russian language struggle to understand verb aspect. I mean, after all, how can a verb be perfective or imperfective? It's not real, it's not alive. How can it be perfect? At the end of this video, you will understand and know how to correctly use imperfective and perfective verbs in the Russian language. Давайте начнем. Всем привет, меня зовут Jared, и я делаю русский язык легким. After I give you the primary use for aspects, there's 4 little nuances which are pretty easy to understand and pick up that I'm also going to give you. With the primary use and these 4 nuances, you're going to be using aspect correctly 99% of the time. Every verb in the Russian language has 2 forms, what they call the imperfective form and the perfective form. I don't know why they picked those words. I'm sure there's some grammatical or English historical reason. I think it's kind of weird and confusing. But just know that when you're learning verbs, there's the imperfective form and the perfective. The Russian language delineates perfective and imperfective verbs with prefixes, like you see in the verb chitat, the imperfective form, or prachitat, the perfective form. They'll do it with different endings. They'll do it with different letters in the middle of the word. And then sometimes there's just totally, completely different words. A lot of people don't know that gavarit and skazat are the exact same word. It's just one is the imperfective, gavarit, and one is the perfective, skazat. There really is no set rules to know the prefixes or suffixes or the middle letters that come in there. It's easiest just to memorize the 2 different forms when you're learning verbs. That may seem a little overwhelming at first, but with time, it becomes very easy. It becomes very natural. And in fact, when you learn a new verb, if you only learn one form, the imperfective, you're going to feel like you're missing out. You're like, wait a minute, what's the perfective form? I'm going to need that. I want to know that. And it gets a lot easier to memorize. Here's the kind of the foundation or the primary use for the perfective and imperfective. And I'm going to approach this a little bit differently than how you've probably previously heard. I'm going to start with the English equivalent. If I say, I was painting, what does that mean to you? It just means I was doing something, right? It tells you what I was doing. Maybe somebody says, hey, what were you doing yesterday? I was painting. That's all. It doesn't talk about how long. It doesn't talk about whether I finished painting. It's just an action. Now, what if I said this? What if I said, I painted the room? What does that kind of insinuate to you? It probably implies that I painted the room and I finished painting the room. You see the difference between I was painting and I painted the room? But what you need to understand is that in Russian, they don't use the words I was painting. They don't say that. They don't have a word for was. They do, but not in this context. And then when you just say, I painted the room, that's just paint in the past tense. But in our language, it insinuates something else. In Russian, it doesn't, without the perfective and imperfective form. They use the imperfective and perfective form of the verbs to show the different aspects of the action that was done. Do you see why we now use the word aspect? So we're emphasizing different things. If we just want to say, hey, I was painting, we don't really care if I finished it or not. That's not what this conversation is about. We use the imperfective. If we want to stress that I finished it, we're going to use the perfective. Now I'm going to get into the nuances of the imperfective and perfective when to use them in a minute. But I just want you to, at this point, understand why they have 2 different words for one verb. And that's because in the English language, we use additional words to convey different meanings. They don't. They use different verb aspects, or they use different forms of the verb to convey that. Let that sink in a little bit there if you need. So I've got this chart here that I think will really help you understand what we're talking about. First section, you can start doing something, right? You can start reading a book. And then after you start it, you go through the next section here and you are reading the book. And in this section, that's kind of what I call the process of doing something. You'll see that word used a lot. If you look up aspect on the internet, they talk about the process of doing something. Or it's the duration of time while you're doing something. Or it's the verb actually being used. It's the action actually being done, if that makes sense. And then you finish it and you complete it. Now, I'm going to divide these 3 sections up into different letters here just to make talking about it in the video a little bit more convenient. The beginning portion I'm going to call A. The duration or the process or the action while you're doing it, I'm going to call that B. And then once you finish it or the act of completing it, I'm going to call that section C. So we have A, B, and C. Pretty easy to understand there. What you'll want to know here, and this is where the little cheat comes in. And again, this is the other thing I wish people had told me when I was learning aspect. It would have made it so much easier. Is if you go through and you're working on sentences or you're saying something and you decide that the verb falls into category A or C, and in a minute I'm going to get to that as to how we know where it falls on this diagram, but just hold on for just a second. If it falls into the categories A or C, you need the perfective form of the verb. If it falls into the middle category, B, you're going to use the imperfective form of the verb. And then again, in some of our examples here, you're going to see it could fall into 2 or 3 of those categories. If it falls into any number of them, if it falls into A and C or A, B, and C, you need the imperfective form. Okay? Perfective for A and C, imperfective for B, and imperfective if you need a combination of any of these. So let's talk about some of the nuances here. A and C, they can only happen at one specific time, and they can only happen in the past tense or the future tense. Okay? You can't start reading a book for a whole day, right? That just doesn't make sense. You either start reading a book or you don't start reading a book. Now, I'm not talking about someone who's lazy and, they're kind of dreading doing their school assignment and it takes all day for them to start doing it, right? That's kind of getting into semantics. What I'm talking about is the literal act of opening a book and starting to read it. It happens at one specific point. Same thing with finishing to read a book. Once you read the last word of that book, you are done. You can't finish reading a book in the present tense. You've either finished reading the book or you will finish reading the book. Here's another big help that I wish somebody had told me when I was learning this. I was always trying to understand the correct grammar. Well, what's the correct form of the verb to use here? Do I need the imperfective or the perfective in this situation? And quite often people would, with good intentions trying to help you, they would respond back, well, you need it because of this situation or because of that situation. And so in my mind, I started coming up with, okay, in this, you need this unless it's that. So I had rules with exceptions, and it just got really confusing. I mean, wow, it was hard to understand. What I wish somebody had told me is that it depends on what I want to convey. I get to choose which aspect I'm using, all right? And I'm going to give you some examples here to understand that. But know that there isn't any technical right or wrong unless, you're trying to get one answer and you use the wrong verb there. But it's whatever you're trying to convey. Go back to my example there of when we were talking about painting. I was painting versus I painted the room. If someone asked me, what did you do yesterday? I was painting, right? It's my decision how I want to answer that. I just want to tell them that I was painting. I don't really care if they know if I finished it or not. But if I've been working on that room for 10 years, and it's my significant other, and I want to tell them, hey, I finally finished it. I said, I painted the room. I mean, how awesome is that? Do you see how as the instigator of the conversation or the answering person, I get to dictate what I want to emphasize there. All right, you've got the chart. You've got some context. Now I want to give you some examples. And examples are really the best way to understand this. If your head's spinning a little bit right now, just know that it will come with you. It's going to come with time, and these examples will really help solidify it. If you are liking this video and you're getting something out of it, I'd love it if you'd smash that like button down below. Okay, let's go into the examples here. The first one I'm going to give you is in Russian. It's "Вчера вечером я читал книгу." So the translation of that sentence would be, yesterday evening, I was reading a book. I'm using the imperfective form, so I know that it goes in section B of our chart here. I'm not focusing on whether I finished the book or not. I'm not talking about when or where I started it. I'm just saying what I was doing last night. I was reading a book. Versus if I said this sentence, "Вчера вечером я прочитал книгу." Then I'm emphasizing that last night I finished reading the book. All right, let's do it the other way on this example. Let's start with the English and go into the Russian. And we want to say that in the summer, they were building a house, okay? Maybe there was a crime of some sort, like, well, where were they? during the summertime. Were they in the city? And we're like, no, they were building a house. They weren't anywhere near the scene of the crime there. Let's go back to our diagram here. Where does that fall in? Are we talking about section A, B, or C? Are we emphasizing, are we conveying, do we want to tell the person who's asking us the question, do we want them to focus on the completion of the action, or are we just focused on the action itself? Okay, we know it's not A because we're really not talking about when it started. We know it's not B because we don't know if they finished building the house or not. We're not concerned about telling the person that. That's not relevant to this story or to this context of the conversation. What's relevant is the fact that they were building it in the summertime. Maybe they finished it, maybe they didn't. And so that is section B. And we know that B takes the imperfective form. And so we would say, Lietem ani stroili dom. Now let's change the story. Let's change the context a little bit. Let's say that we're showing somebody this house that was built. And we want to say that they built the house in the summer. Maybe it was a really hot summer. It was, 110 degrees. And you're like, can you believe that they built this thing in the summer? And we're showing that it is done, and we're emphasizing that now. Okay, we go back to our little chart here, and I think you guys know where I'm going with this. We're emphasizing section C here, that it was completed in the summer. It's not just important to us that they were actually doing the action, but what's important to the conversation, or what we're trying to convey to the listener, is that they actually finished it in the summertime. And we know that C requires the perfective verb. So we would say, Lietem ani pastroili dom. Look how similar these two sentences are in Russian. Lietem ani stroili dom and Lietem ani pastroili dom. They're almost identical, except the first one uses the imperfective form. The second one uses the perfective form, and we get two different meanings to the sentence because they're using the imperfective and perfective form, whereas in English, we would have to use these extra words. They were building in the summer versus they built it in the summer. Is it starting to make a little bit of sense now? Is it starting to come around? Okay, let me give you one more example here, and then I'm going to give you a little test. I'm going to let you see if you can figure out which form of the verbs should work for you. Let's say that you want to ask someone if they've read Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. Great book, by the way. If you haven't read it, highly recommend it. Okay, so here's kind of three sentences. Were you reading Anna Karenina yesterday? All right, so let's pull up our little chart here. Were you reading Anna Karenina yesterday? What are we talking about? What's important? Is the emphasis on the completion? Did they finish it? Or is it just on the action itself? We're just asking what they did. We don't know if they finished it. We don't really care. We just want to know, hey, what were you doing? So it's B. It would be the imperfective form. Ty chitala Annu Kareninu včera. Were you reading Anna Karenina yesterday? Okay, here's another sentence. Did you finish reading Anna Karenina yesterday? Now, maybe there's a school assignment and it's due today and you're meeting up with your buddy on college campus. You're like, hey, did you finish Anna Karenina last night? Ty prachital Annu Kareninu. We're using the perfective because we're focusing on the completion of the activity. Did you actually finish reading it? I don't want to just know if you read it. I want to know, did you finish it? Because I didn't finish reading it. I was just reading it. Okay, and here's one that's a little bit different. Have you ever read Anna Karenina? Now, this one's a little different from the other examples that I've given you, but I'm giving it to you on purpose. Are we talking about the beginning or the end or the act? Well, if you've ever read Anna Karenina, you obviously have started it. You may or may not have finished it. Most of my friends who start it don't finish it, unfortunately. But you've also gone through the duration of it a little bit. If you've started it and read it, and remember at the beginning, I talked about if you ever need B or a combination of any of these areas in the chart, you're going to use the imperfective form of the verb. So in this case, we would use the imperfective form. Ty когда-нибудь читал Анну Каренину? Have you ever read Anna Karenina? And then the person might answer читал, and that would mean, yeah, I've read it. Or they may answer да, прочитал, and that would mean, yes, I have read it, meaning I've finished it. Do you see how the person giving the answer there is giving a little bit more information to the person asking the question? Have you ever read it? Да, читал. That probably means, yeah, I've read it, but I didn't finish it. Although it's not definitive. If they said prочитал, then that is definitive. They've read it and they've finished reading it. Okay, let me give you a little bit of a test here to see how you're doing. We're going to use the verb pisat and napisat. Pisat is the imperfective, napisat is the perfective. And the test here is not so much about conjugating the nouns or if you know all the vocabulary. All we want to focus on is, would you use the imperfective or the perfective form of this verb? Okay, we're not going for a literal translation into Russian right now. If you don't know the other words, don't worry about it. Okay, here's the first sentence. I already read the letter. I read it last week. Pull up the chart and ask yourself, are we talking about section A, B, or C, or a combination of those two? Remember, A and C get the perfective verb. B, or a combination of sections, get the imperfective form. I'll give you just a few seconds here to figure that out. I already read the letter. I read it last week. Okay, that's correct. We're focused on the completion of the act. Maybe someone's like, have you even read this letter? You know, they're a little ticked off that you're having a conversation about it. And you want to emphasize that, yeah, I already read it. I read it last week. So we would use, we're talking about the completion of the action. So that's section C of this little chart here. So we need the perfective form. Okay, here's another sentence. Last week, I wrote letters. Where does that fit in the diagram here? Where does that fit in the chart? A, B, or C? I'm going to give you just a second to figure that out. That's correct. It goes into section B. We're not talking about whether you finished writing the letters. That's not relevant to this conversation. You're just saying what you did last week. I wrote letters, and that requires the imperfective form. Okay, now I'm going to give you two sentences in Russian. They're the exact same sentences, but one uses the imperfective form and one uses the perfective form. And I want to see if you can get how you would correctly translate this into English or whatever your native language that is there. Okay, the verb is chitat, that's to read, and that's the imperfective form, and prachitat is the perfective. So here's the first sentence. Я читал книгу за 2 дня. And the second sentence is the exact same, but with the perfective form. Я прочитал книгу за 2 дня. How would you translate each one of these into English? I'll give you just a few seconds there to think about it. Okay, the first sentence is Я читал книгу за 2 дня. I'm going to admit it's a little bit of a trick question because if you hadn't studied prepositions yet, that may be new to you here, but the correct translation for this sentence would be, I read the book for 2 days. Don't know if I finished it or not. I'm just saying I read it for 2 days. Versus the other sentence, Я прочитал книгу за 2 дня. I read the book in 2 days. You're stressing that I finished it in 2 days. Okay, if you finished Anna Karenina in 2 days, wow, it's a big, thick book. That would be very impressive. Versus, yeah, I was on vacation and 2 of those days I just read Anna Karenina. It was great and wonderful. I want to go on and talk about the future tense a little bit here. If you'll remember at the very beginning, I said sections A and C could not be in the present tense, and it can't be. If you're talking about anything in the present tense that's happening right now, it's always going to be the imperfective form. Anytime a perfective verb is conjugated, i.e. it's not in its past tense, it's automatically referring to the future tense, and it's putting emphasis on the completion of the action. So if we said, Завтра я буду читать журнал. Tomorrow I'm going to read the magazine. Maybe you're going to sit out on the beach, read it and relax, and that's great. Versus, Завтра я прочитаю журнал. Tomorrow I'm going to read the magazine and I'm going to finish it. Maybe it's an assignment for school or something like that. Okay? Do you see how there's not one right or wrong aspect of the verb to use? You could use the imperfective or the perfective. It's just what you as the speaker want to convey to the listener. What do you want to tell them? Are you just telling them I'm going to read? Or do you want to convey that I'm going to finish reading it? It's totally up to you. Okay, you guys, that's the primary use of aspect verbs in Russian. Now I'm going to go into the 4 different nuances that will really help you drill down into the perfective and imperfective and use it correctly. And these aren't exceptions to the rule. They're just certain instances that require special attention to how you use the aspect of verbs. you'll see what I mean here once we get going. The first has to do with repetition. When things are repeating, even if they are completed, you want to use the imperfective form. So if you wanted to say, every day I start at 7 o'clock. Now you start at 7 and you finish starting and you're done, but you do it every single day. It's repetitious. So that would be the imperfective form of the verb. Каждый день я начинаю в 7 часов. Every day I start at 7 o'clock. Also, if you're talking about a repetition of things, one thing done after another, so sort of a sequential order. Even if you finish doing all of those things, you're still going to want to use the imperfective form. So let's say, somebody says, well, what did you do today? Well, I read, I did my homework, and then I went to bed. Я читал, я делал домашнее задание, и тогда спал. Okay, so the repetition of things, the sequential order of things, gets the imperfective form of the verb. The next little nuance that you're going to want to know about is simultaneous versus consecutive. For my non-native English speakers, I'm going to define those words just a little bit more because they're similar, but they're different. Simultaneous means two things going on at the same time. Consecutive means one thing happening and then another thing happening. So when things are simultaneous, happening at the same time, you can probably guess we want the imperfective form, right? Because the perfective can't be in the present tense. They can't both happen at the same time. So for simultaneous, we're going to use imperfective. For consecutive, we're going to use the perfective form. So let me give you an example here. Когда он смотрел телевизор, он играл на iPad. While he watched TV, he played on his iPad. Both of the verbs, играть and смотреть, are in the imperfective form because both actions are happening at the same time. Here's an example for consecutive. Когда он прочитал журнал, он начал играть на iPad. Once he finished reading the magazine, he started playing on his iPad. Meaning, after he did the one thing, then he started the other thing. Simultaneous, imperfective. Consecutive, perfective. Okay, let's go on and talk about the next little nuance there. And that is negation, or when you're saying not. The thing that you'll want to differentiate here is when you failed to do something, meaning there was some implication that you were supposed to do it, but you didn't do it, versus you just didn't do it. There was no implication that you had to do it, you just didn't do it. Я не прочитал книгу. This means that, yeah, you didn't finish reading it, but because we've negated it with the ni, meaning I didn't read the book, it has the implication that he was supposed to have read the book. Maybe it was a school assignment, or you told somebody that you were going to read it. Я не прочитал книгу. Versus if you just say, я не читал книгу, then there was no obligation there to read it. Again, maybe just someone's asking you, did you read Anna Karenina? Я не читал. I haven't read it. There's no obligation there on my part. I haven't done that yet. Here's one more example that I think will really help you solidify how this works here. Я не позвонил. Okay, that means I didn't call, and because I'm using the perfective form, it means that I was supposed to have called. Maybe I'm exchanging numbers with somebody because I want to take them out on a date, but я не позвонил. I was supposed to have called them, but I didn't. Versus я не звонил. I didn't call. Maybe somebody's like, who called me at 3 a.m. yesterday? Я не звонил. It wasn't me. I didn't call. There was no obligation to do it, but it wasn't me performing that action. You see how there's the implied obligation, and when you failed to do it, it gets the perfective form. No obligation, and you just didn't do it, it gets the imperfective form. Last little nuance here, you guys. If you're prohibited from doing something, you use the perfective form. If you just physically can't do it, you're going to use the imperfective form. So let me give you some examples here. If you don't know the word nельзя, I highly recommend you learn it. It's an awesome word. It means can't, not allowed, depending on the perfective and imperfective form of the verb here. So if you see a sign or someone says nельзя входить, that means you're not allowed to enter. Okay, maybe it's a backstage door and that's where all the actors are and they don't want you going in there. Nельзя входить. You physically could go in, but you're not allowed. It's prohibited. But if someone says nельзя войти, that means you physically can't get in. Maybe the door is blocked, or maybe it's locked. You physically can't get in. You're allowed to, but you just physically can't do it. Okay, here's one more example. Нельзя закрыть окно. You're not allowed to close the window. Maybe you're in a school setting, it's really hot, and the teacher's talking to the little first grader, and she's like, no, don't close the window. It's too hot. We need some fresh air in here. Nельзя закрыть окно. Or maybe it's the middle of winter. Some little goofball did open up the window. It's cold, and she's trying to shut the window, but there's a bunch of snow and ice that's, formed there, and she can't close it, and she's trying to convey that message to the students. Then she would say, Nельзя закрывать окно. Meaning I can't get the window shut. I can't shut the window because there's this ice that's formed blocking it. If you're serious about learning Russian, subscribe to this channel. I put out 2 videos every week, and my goal is just to make learning Russian easier. Ну хорошо, это все. Спасибо и увидимся.